Did you know that parents rank financial literacy as the #1 most difficult life skill to teach? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app for families. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Kids learn to earn, save, and spend wisely, and parents can rest easy knowing their kids are learning about money with guardrails in place. Try Greenlight risk-free today at greenlight.com/audio.
It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting. Just email me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Now, if you like our show, be sure and check out our Patreon. Everything we do, AM, FM radio, Monday to Friday. You can find all those shows on Patreon with all the ads and the commercials cut out. There's also a lot of exclusive content that we provide to the listeners on Patreon. Right now, I don't know if you watched this Netflix documentary out there about the octopus and Dana Castellero, but I have a lot of exclusive documents from Bill Hamilton himself, the center of that story, who I've interviewed exclusively after 35 years. The guy's never done a radio interview. So if you want to know the real story about that octopus and Inslaw and the Promise software, check out Opperman Report on Patreon. And I got a lot of exclusive documents you haven't heard on that documentary there on Netflix. Our live show is Friday night. You can get all of our archives at Spreaker.com. I do a live show there every Friday night. There's a chat room, and you get an email notification whenever we put up new content. So be sure and subscribe for free at Spreaker.com. I'm really excited about our show today. We have a fellow named Laurent Guyénot. He's written a book called The Unspoken Kennedy Truth, and it's a different theory on the Kennedy assassination. Mr. Guyénot, are you there?
Yeah, hello, Ed. I'm here.
Thank you so much. Tell us about yourself. Before we get started in your book, The Unspoken Kennedy Truth, who is Laurent Guyénot?
Well, I'm French. I'm 63 years old. I originally, just stick to the my academic background. So I had originally an engineering degree, but about in 2011 I had just finished a doctorate in medieval studies. So the Middle Ages is another of my main interests in history. But I also, I kind of became interested in 9/11. I suddenly, in 2011, just coming out of the Middle Ages, discovered, that there's something wrong in the official story of 9/11, and it really hooked me, and I became really fascinated, and I really wanted to study what I would call American deep history, So that led me from 9/11 to study, the Kennedy case, which I had no idea about at that time, but I got really fascinated by it. And then, so I studied all these, and since I lived in the United States, I'm pretty, I can read English, so at some point I felt I have to write a book, so I first wrote a book in French, because I felt French people need to know all these things, which was not available in French at that time, and still not, actually. So that's what got me started to study about deep history, what I would call deep history, the stories. And that led me to Israel, and that, because I had also some background in biblical studies, that led me to try to understand what is Israel, what is Zionism. And then I wrote this other book that was before my book on Kennedy, called From Yahweh to Zion. That's the book that I try to understand how much I felt. Actually, that to understand Zionism, to understand Israel, you really have to understand the connection with the Old Testament, with the Hebrew Bible, and what the Jewish people read in there. That's basically what how I can introduce myself.
Gotcha.
I hope that's enough.
No, that's fine, sure. And you got a book coming out too, Papal Curse. What's that about?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in religious history too. I'm basically a religious person, but not not in a traditional Christian sense. So I'm questioning. As a student of the Middle Ages, I started to read. I'm always interested in the Middle Ages. So for the last 3 or 4 years, I wrote different articles about the Christianity in the Middle Age in Europe. And I became very interested, for example, in Byzantium, in the Orthodox tradition. So I studied this conflict, this century-long conflict between Rome and Constantinople. So that's what the book is about mostly. Trying to find to bring a different perspective on medieval history, because when you study the Middle Ages in Europe or in the United States, maybe it's a little bit different now because a lot of people have brought a fresh look at Byzantium. But in Europe, basically, when you talk about the Middle Age, people focus on Europe or sometimes even on France or England and completely ignore, the East, ignore Byzantium. And so we have a completely biased perspective. So, I try to get into that and show a different perspective on basically Europe versus the East, the Byzantine empires, and these kind of things.
So, what are we going to find here in this book, The Unspoken Kennedy Truth?
Well, you will find what is not spoken about in most Kennedy books, and the title is actually an ironic reference to James Douglas's bestseller titled the JFK and the Unspeakable. JFK and the Unspeakable by James Douglas has become, really, it's a great book. I write in the introduction, it's a great book. Just the problem is that it's missing basically 2/3 of the truth, because it focuses on the CIA, and the CIA killed John Kennedy is almost, you could almost say today, the mainstream conspiracy theory about Kennedy. Who killed Kennedy? Well, the CIA killed John Kennedy. Even John Kennedy's nephew, Robert Kennedy Jr., say that today. So I suppose in America, I would guess about 75% of people would kind of believe that the CIA got John Kennedy killed. But in my opinion, as I studied, and I started from that theory basically because that's the big door. When you enter into studying who killed Kennedy, you just enter through that door. But then little by little, having also studied 9/11 and having concluded that, who did 9/11 has a lot to do with Israel, then I started to think about it. And of course, sooner or later, you have to, if you really want to study seriously, you have to read Michael Collins Piper's pioneering book called what's it called? Final Judgment. And that was the only book in the 1990s which pointed to Israel's involvement in the assassination of Kennedy, based basically originally the big piece of information that kind of started this research, looking at if Israel is involved, was, all this story about the struggle between John Kennedy and David Ben-Gurion over Israel's determination to get the atomic bomb. That story now is pretty much is quite well known, but in the 1990s it was just coming up. So But there are many other elements, of course, that leads to the conclusion, to my conclusion, that actually the prime mover, I'm not saying the CIA was not involved, but I'm saying, well, when you talk about the CIA, you have to first ask who in the CIA. The CIA is a big thing, it's very compartmented. So, but basically the prime mover for me, now in my view was Israel. And when I say Israel, I mean primarily David Ben-Gurion, actually.
Now, what would the motivation be for Israel and Ben-Gurion to assassinate Kennedy?
There are different levels of motivations, in my view, and the more I studied, the more I saw, the wide spectrum of motives for Israel. The most urgent motives, I think. I would say there were three of them. The most important one is the one on which Michael Collins Piper insisted, is that in 1963, well, from the very beginning, Israel was determined to get the atomic bomb. Ben-Gurion, we know from the very beginning, thought, his little country is surrounded by Arab countries, and there's only one way he can keep them, from destroying his country is nuclear deterrence. So he was absolutely determined to get the atomic bomb. On the other hand, John Kennedy, most important mission that he gave himself on the worldwide level, and this is very well documented by James Douglas in the book I mentioned, is that he wanted to abolish nuclear weapons. So he wanted to start a denuclearization of the world, and not only actually nuclear weapons, but actually weapons of mass destruction. He had a very ambitious vision of ending world wars, by starting by denuclearize the world. So at that time it was possible. There were just 4 or 5 nations which had the atomic bomb. So it was a realistic plan, and he tried to involve. We have many speeches, public speeches that from 1961 he gave this mission to the United Nations. So there was a very intense conflict that started to develop between John Kennedy and David Ben-Gurion, and that conflict came to a point of crisis in 1963, when Kennedy, having learned already from 1960, actually even before taking his function, he knew the CIA informed him that there was something going on in Israel in the Dimona plant. They were making nuclear devices, so he knew about it. He tried to negotiate. He tried to gain time, and Israel tried to gain time. But in 1963, John Kennedy was very strongly demanding from David Ben-Gurion that he wants to inspect what's going on. So he wanted absolutely an inspection in the summer of 1963, which did not happen, but because Ben-Gurion actually resigned in, I think, June 1963. Ben-Gurion resigned for no official reason, just for personal reason. At the very day he was supposed to receive John Kennedy's letter, which was a very strong letter. It's available. It's declassified. A very strong, threatening letter saying, "I demand, immediate inspection, and otherwise our relationship will deteriorate." So there was this very intense conflict. And so there was no way out of this conflict for David Ben-Gurion. Are you here?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm listening.
Strange noises.
No, you're hearing noises? Like
okay.
What? I'm not hearing.
No, but it's probably coming from my computer then.
Okay.
No problem.
Okay. Well, then a quick question, just to I don't want to interrupt, but
okay.
If Israel is created in 1948 and Kennedy's assassinated in 1963, it was a very young country. Did they have the capability to pull something that off, a 15-year-old country?
Well, that's a good question, actually.
Especially to add more too, they had so many distractions that their local disputes with their neighbors, around that time too as well. Did they have that kind of worldwide capability?
Well, the fact is, of course, we can get into how did they do it, but the fact is they did it. We know that in 1967 they had already 1 or 2 atomic warheads. So, and now they probably have 90, probably maybe 100. So the fact is they did. In 1963 was a critical time when their nuclear reactor went critical in a way that I don't know much about the technical aspect, but as I learned in the summer of 1963 was the time when inspections had to be conducted, because after that time the reactor went critical and inspection could not be done. The way they did it actually originally was with French help. Before Charles de Gaulle became president again, there was a deal between the French government and the Israeli government officially to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. Of course, that's always been Israel's official explanation. So they moved quite quickly in the 1950s with the help of France. Then under Eisenhower also they got some scientific collaboration to develop nuclear energy, always of course officially for peaceful purposes. But there was also a lot of smuggling of material, nuclear material, enriched uranium, but also devices that they needed for this, and this has been documented by a couple of books, how they smuggled material with the help of one guy that we'll have to talk about, James Jesus Angleton in the CIA. So they moved quite quickly, with a lot of help from crypto-Zionists, I would say, people who were, or we could call them actually psionims, scientists and engineers and politicians in the United States, but also, the countries that helped them to develop, to get the knowledge, to get the technology, to get the material. But anyway, the fact is, in 1963 they were almost ready, and in 1967 they definitely had the atomic bomb already, which also is part of something that is important to understand what went in 1967. Just like today, actually, it's important to know that they have about 100 nuclear warheads. It's important to know that because it's part of the explanation of what's going on in Gaza today, why they are doing what they are doing with impunity and with an incredible arrogance, knowing that they are almost untouchable.
Oh, yeah, certainly today, yeah. There's no doubt that Israel, as a military, is obscene. And to give them more aid at this point, there must be more tanks than they have people to drive tanks at this point. They must have more, more weaponry than they have people to operate the weaponry at this point. Mm-hmm. It's just insane. But real quick, we're talking to Laurent Guyénot. I forgot to mention, you can find his writing at unz.com, unz.com, the Unz Review. Now, so you make a good case. Okay, the motivation was to obtain the atomic bomb.
That's the first motivation.
Oh, go ahead. What else?
Yeah. Well, I mean, very quickly, I think if you study really Kennedy's life with all the materials available today, you have to realize that he was very much pro-Arab. Not at all pro-Israel. So he had made a good relationship with Nasser, Egypt president, and he was from the very beginning, even from the 1950s, even long before he became president, he was a person who wanted to support nationalist movements in Africa. And he was not a friend of Israel in any way at all, even though and of course he was very much his father's son. And as I studied, the whole thing, I came to also the conclusion that Jewish people in Israel, especially, but even people, educated people in the United States, knew very well that John Kennedy was his father's son, and Joe Kennedy, John's father was, of course, had been or was at least known, rightly or wrongly, but to have been an appeaser. In other words, a man who wanted to avoid World War II and who preferred to talk with Adolf Hitler rather than start World War II. So he had been an ambassador in London in the 1930s, and from 1936 to 1940. And he supported Neville Chamberlain appeasement policy, the British Prime Minister. So there was a background, from the point of view of David Ben-Gurion that already created a very hostile relationship between the two men. But definitely Dimona was the main reason. The other reason I said is his pro-Nasser policy. He wanted to support Nasser. Who was basically Israel's most dangerous enemy for Israel. And a third reason is connected to Robert Kennedy, who was his Attorney General, who had started a procedure to force what was not called the AIPAC, at that time was called the American Zionist Council. He wanted to force them to register as foreign agent. In other words, he wanted to cut their wings or to diminish considerably their power of influence in American politics. And if you understand the power of AIPACs today, you can understand that it was a big issue for Israel. So there was at least those three very important issues, but definitely the Dimona issue was the most urgent one. But I came more and more to realize that if you want to understand why Kennedy was killed, you have also to ask the question in a different way. You have to realize that the reason Kennedy was killed was not just to get rid of Kennedy, was to put Lyndon Johnson in power. Because you have to study what's the difference between Lyndon Johnson and John Kennedy. And that's something that American people did not really see at the time, but now we can see very clearly. Lyndon Johnson was absolutely pro-Israel. Lyndon Johnson green-lighted Israel's aggression on Egypt in 1967, even to the point of betraying his own navy with the USS Liberty attack of Israel. And under the watch of Lyndon Johnson, Israel got pretty much everything they wanted, including the nuclear weapon. So that's the two sides. You have to understand that Kennedy died not just to get rid of him, but in order for Lyndon Johnson to become president. And there was no time to waste because Lyndon Johnson would not have been on the ticket for the election in 1 year after, in November 1964. And he was actually already under pressure because there was a few corruption scandals. And his name was connected to them. So that's another reason.
Okay, then let me. Okay, so it's clear that Israel benefited from the assassination, but how could they? The Secret Service was involved, the autopsy, the Dallas police. You know what I mean? Many of the shooters have been identified as being the CIA anti-Castro crowd, the Watergate crowd, that group. In my opinion, at least. So then, how did they pull all that off? How did they have the local juice to pull that off?
Well, there's two things I can say about that. The first is Lyndon Johnson. Of course, the prime suspect is always Lyndon Johnson, and there are many books actually that say Lyndon Johnson killed Kennedy. Why? But just to become president, of course. So Lyndon Johnson was very much connected to Israel, but that connection is not so easy to see. It's not so clear, but it's it's documented anyway. Anyway, in Lyndon Johnson's White House, there were many Zionists. So he was okay. So that's, of course, in Dallas. He was killed in Dallas, Texas, and Lyndon Johnson was a Texan. So we can assume that in Dallas, Lyndon Johnson had the means and the opportunity to organize the ambush.
Let me ask you this. Is there any kind of historical documentation of Johnson or Johnson's representatives negotiating with the State of Israel prior to the assassination?
No,
Context?
no, I don't think so. But there is a strong connection with Abraham Feinberg. Abraham Feinberg is a key person in the case because he was a financier of the Democrats in America for many years. But he was also one of the most important person for the financing of Israel's nuclear program. So he had both these, he was both involved in buying politicians in the Democratic Party and trying to find funds and financing and also organizing smuggling of different material for the, and that's well documented actually even by Seymour Hersh in his book, The Samson Option. That's a very important book. That's a book that got Michael Collins Piper's on this trail because Seymour Hersh was one of the first to document this conflict between Kennedy and David Ben-Gurion over Dimona, the Samson Option. So he documents the fact that Lyndon Johnson was very much Israel's man from 1948, from his first election to the Senate. But Lyndon Johnson and Israel, in my opinion, are the prime movers, and they are one. That's the same team. In other words, but one key element to understand how it worked is to focus on the man on whom actually any investigation should start with, because we don't know who pulled the trigger and killed Kennedy. I mean, some people say they know, but basically there's no certainty. But one thing we know is we know who killed the patsy. We know who killed Lee Harvey Oswald. So let's start with this man. I mean, it's natural. Who is Jack Ruby? Jack Ruby is the man who killed Lee Harvey Oswald just one day after he was arrested, or 2 days after. And Jack Ruby's name is Jacob Rubinstein, and that already is a piece of information which has been hidden from most people. Most people never heard about his real name. And Jack Ruby, people who have heard that, well, he's from the mafia, from the Chicago mafia, but actually that's not true. He's from the Jewish mafia. He belongs to the Jewish underworld, which is actually very much connected, and these connections are very, very well documented to the Irgun, to the terrorist networks that was creating terror attacks against the British in the 1930s and 1940s. So Jack Ruby had been involved in that period mostly as smuggling weapons to Israel in the 1940s. So Jack Ruby is clearly connected to the Jewish underworld led by Meyer Lansky. And Michael Collins Piper has done a lot of documentation on that connection. So here you have a very clear, well-documented connection between the people who were directly involved, because Jack Ruby, there's no way to take him away from that equation. He's definitely connected to the people who killed Kennedy. His mission was to silence the patsy. But of course, he was given that mission by people who were involved directly in the killing of John Kennedy. So Jack Ruby, or Jacob Rubinstein, as his real name is a very important person to focus on, and that's probably the reason why nobody focuses on him. You don't learn anything about Jack Ruby in James Douglas's book, for example, because he was not CIA. He was Mossad, basically.
You mentioned too James Angleton.
Yeah.
How does he?
Okay. Yeah.
How does he fit in with Israel?
Well, James Jesus Angleton is a guy. He was a CIA. He was head of the counterintelligence service in the CIA. But what not so many people know is that he was also the head of the Israel account, or the Israeli desk, and he was the exclusive liaison with the Mossad in the CIA. So recently, Jefferson Morley, wrote a very important book, a biography of James Jesus Angleton, where he basically shows that Angleton was closer to the Mossad than to his own hierarchy in the CIA. And he was absolutely very much pro-Israel, and he was willing to do anything for Israel, including looking the other way when the Mossad was smuggling nuclear material from the United States. So Jefferson Morley's book came out in 2017, and it really brought a lot of new information that reinforced the theory that Israel was involved. Because for a long time, Angleton's name came out by, in the research of people who were looking about at the CIA's involvement. Because when we say CIA killed Kennedy, it doesn't mean anything. You have to know who in the CIA could be involved. And the name that always comes up is Angleton. Already for the last 40 years, everybody ends up at Angleton's door. Right. But what people didn't know is that Angleton was not only the counterintelligence chief. So he was the reason why people end up targeting Angleton in their research is because he's the one who kind of created Oswald's legend. Everything connected with Oswald, his kind of a profile as a communist, pro-Castro, pro-Soviet Union communist. This was under the surveillance, under the control of Angleton. That's why everybody who is looking at CIA involvement ends up pointing to Angleton. There's nobody else, actually. People sometimes mention Richard Helms, but actually there's no clear evidence that Richard Helms was involved in any way. But there is definitely very clear evidence that James Jesus Angleton was involved, very much involved. And when you realize that actually Angleton was also surrounded by Mossad agent, he was very friendly. He was in very friendly terms with Mossad agent. He went to Israel a few times. When he died, he was honored by Mossad chiefs and even two heads of states. There was actually two ceremonies in his honor when he died, and he has now monuments in Israel in his honor. So the connection between Angleton and Israel is also very strong. On the other hand, Angleton is a man who was doing his own thing. Even his boss, Richard Helms, didn't know much about what he was doing. So, even so, in other words, even when you look at the CIA's involvement in Kennedy's assassination, you end up looking at Israel's involvement. So whether you look at the CIA through Angleton, you end up at Israel. Or if you look at who killed Oswald, you end up at Israel. And if you study Lyndon Johnson also, who is definitely involved too, you also end up at Israel. So it's like all roads in Kennedy research lead you to Israel. And then when you study the whole thing about Dimona, the intense struggle between David Ben-Gurion and Kennedy, which people didn't know about until the 1990s. That's what, and from the 1990s, everything changed in the research.
I want to back up just real quickly about Jefferson Morley. I just had Jefferson Morley on the show just recently. I've had him on a couple of times, and he just came out with a new Marina Oswald tape. He had an interview with Marina Oswald he did about 50 years ago that he just published recently. So, and I don't want to be on the wrong side of Jefferson Morley. Okay.
No.
But I just want to make sure he has the information that Angleton was involved with had a connection had the Israeli desk. But does he subscribe to your theory of Israel being behind the assassination?
No. Yeah. No, it's important to be precise on that point. No, he doesn't. That's right.
Because he's already mad at me. I got to be careful.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. He doesn't, but he is getting closer to it. One of his latest article, very strangely, is about what's it called? Translated in French, actually, because it was very interesting. He shows that in the newest declassified documents about Kennedy's assassination, the title of his article is in those newly declassified documents, Israel's nuclear secrets are safe, because he wants to show that Israel's name is always redacted. For example, in the document where Angleton speak about his the fact that he was heading the Israel account, the Israeli account, that's what the name he gives. Israel is censored, is whitened, and so he wonders, and so he points out that there is a censorship on the fact that Angleton was involved very deeply with the Mossad, including in helping them getting, that's what Morley says. He documents that Angleton was helping Israel to get nuclear technology. But I don't know, I'm not in his head, in Jefferson Morley's head. I feel, and I hope he hears that, I feel he's moving in that direction, but very cautiously, and he wants to accumulate enough material to help us go in that direction without saying where he's heading really. So I don't know exactly what's his strategy, but I definitely feel he's bringing a lot of information that reinforce that theory.
Yeah, I would encourage people to go to JFK Facts podcast and check out he just played his recent releasing this interview with Marina Oswald. You never hear anywhere, right? So now, one of the chapters in your book calls RFK's false flag assassination. What's that about?
Well, it's, Robert Kennedy's assassination is also very bizarre, incredibly strange, but many people, including Robert Kennedy's son, who went to visit Sirhan and studied the whole thing, and under the invitation of his friend who actually got shot that day, what's his name? I forgot, never mind. But anyway, he studied the case, and he's convinced that Sirhan, who is still in prison, did not kill his father. Sirhan definitely shot, but his bullets did not reach. So I think we don't have time to get into all the details, the technical details of the autopsy, for example, which proved that Robert Kennedy was shot from behind at very close range, and that could not have been the bullets coming from Sirhan, who was always in front and at least 2 or 3 feet away. So why do I call it a false flag? Because Sirhan is a Palestinian,
Gotcha.
And from the very beginning, and especially actually after 9/11, the story came up again, and and a lot of articles said, well, Sirhan was the prototype or the precursor of the Arab terrorists who were killed because of their hatred of Israel. So there's been a newspaper articles in the Israeli press, for example, saying, well, Robert Kennedy was killed because he was pro-Israel, and he was killed by a Palestinian who hated Israel, so he was a victim of anti-Semitism and these kind of things. But the problem is Sirhan did not kill Robert Kennedy. So the question then is, who had interest in having a Palestinian patsy? Who had interest in having the story that Robert Kennedy was killed by a Palestinian? Because no Kennedy was pro-Israel. Robert Kennedy was more pro-Israel than his brother. They were not. They were heads of state, so they had a balanced view of the Middle East. But basically, to say that Robert Kennedy was pro-Israel is absolutely ridiculous. He was the one who absolutely wanted to destroy the power of AIPAC, so definitely he was not a friend of Israel. So a false flag assassination in the sense that it was blamed on a Palestinian, and it is still blamed on the Palestinian today, which is very convenient, of course, for Israel.
Very interesting, because you're right. Obviously, Sirhan's a patsy. And so they could have chosen anybody to be that patsy. They could have chosen another guy from Russia, another Russian defector, you know
exactly.
what I mean? Or something along those lines. Why did they choose a Palestinian? Correct. That's very interesting.
Yeah, on a superficial level, it gives Israel an alibi because, Robert Kennedy was killed because he was pro-Israel. So, of course, Israel has nothing to do with it. And, that's a superficial story. But, when you dig a little bit, you realize, well, no, Robert Kennedy was absolutely not pro-Israel, and Saran did not kill him. So who made up that story?
Yeah, and we've done many, many shows on the RFK assassination. They've destroyed the crime scene. It's pathetic, that whole story. There's another chapter in your book about Forrestal, James Forrestal. What's that about?
Well, the story of James Forrestal is not directly connected to the Kennedy story, but I felt it was interesting to put a chapter there based on a book, mostly based on a book by David Martin. David Martin wrote a book called, I don't know, I forgot the title, but it's a very important book. I got almost all the information from this book. And it's interesting because David Martin concludes, and I agree with him, that basically James Forrestal was killed by the Zionists. There was under Truman. That must have been 1948. I think he died. He was officially he committed suicide. He jumped from the window of the Navy hospital. Actually, the same hospital where Kennedy's fake autopsy was done. So there's something going on in the Bethesda, I think, Navy hospital near Washington. And so the story of James Forrestal's assassination is interesting to compare to Kennedy's story because it shows that the Zionist or the Zionist terror network, connected to the Jewish mafia in the United States, had the means and almost the habit of destroying people who were threatening their because James Forrestal was definitely a threat for Israel. He was retiring, and he intended to create a magazine, and he was definitely both very anti-communist but also very angry at Israel and very disappointed by Truman's recognition of Israel and so on.
Yeah.
So he was on the same wavelength. He was not exactly a friend of the Kennedys, but he knew he was, well, we could almost say a friend of Joe Kennedy, the father. He was more of the generation of Joe Kennedy. His son, actually, John Kennedy hired his son in his government. I forgot exactly what, but the two families were connected. They were both Irish Catholic. They were connected.
You hear these stories about death by window. That's why I live on the first floor. And I make a point of pointing that out. And by the way, David Martin, too, he's been on the show as well. His work on the Vince Foster case. So people can go back and look that up as well and listen to David Martin. Okay, so what about the actual shooters, though? Do you believe the actual shooters were Mossad trained, Israeli trained, or did they use CIA shooters?
I have no idea. On this, I have absolutely no certainty. I suppose, whoever pulled the trigger must have been paid to do that. So you can pay either Corsicans, mafiosi, or Cuban, probably some Cuban exiles, anti-Castro Cuban exiles were probably hired. I don't know exactly. I know there are many theories, but I did not get into that because I feel it's not that important because, whoever wanted to get rid of Kennedy, whether Lyndon Johnson or Israel or anybody, would hire snipers from the underworld. They would definitely not send CIA agents, or they would definitely not send Mossad agents there, I think. So they were not caught, so we don't know who they were. So I have no special information or special, idea about that.
So the book we're talking about today is called The Unspoken Kennedy Truth. And now, what kind of reception have you had with this? Because it's so easy to accuse you of anti-Semitism. What kind of backlash have you had over this?
None really. I mean, my original article, long before I published the book, was on the UNS review. Is always one of the favorite articles. It comes up always on top, because it's, I don't know, it must be relayed here and there and maybe translated. And the book is selling, quite regularly. It's only on the Amazon. It's self-published, and it's. I get a lot of positive response. I get a lot of support from readers who say, they feel this is the right track, and I think the theory. I consider myself like a disciple of Michael Collins Piper, because but Piper's book is too big and gets lost in all kinds of details about characters who in my view are not that essential, like Clay Shaw and these kind of people. So I try to do a short book getting to the essential, to the most important and most well documented points. So it's a short book, and it's meant to lay out the main arguments, and I think it's quite convincing. And yeah, I'm very happy. I feel I've done some very useful work, because a lot of people tell me it's just very convincing.
And what about backlash and retaliation? Because I go through stuff all day long. We know a lot of the same people. And I got harassment, all kind of crap going on in my life. You have no idea. And so what about, have you had any kind of backlash in your personal life?
Well, fortunately, I'm in France, and Kennedy is not a big issue in France. It's also it's far away, and it's a long time ago, and so I haven't had any. Well, I mean, yes, I've lost my job as a teacher, but that was more because of 9/11. But yeah, I've had some trouble, but not that serious.
Gotcha.
So
it seems like the last chapter is the coup that enslaved America. Can you describe that for us?
Well, yeah, the coup, because I think the only way to understand John Kennedy's assassination is to understand it as a coup d'etat. It was a change of government. And people did not see it then because, Lyndon Johnson kept most of Kennedy's ministers. Robert McNamara and all these people, they stayed with Johnson. So people felt, this is, it's the same team. So they assumed that whatever Lyndon Johnson would do it was exactly what Kennedy would have done. But from now we understand that there's only one thing that dramatically changed in the policy of the United States between Kennedy and Johnson, and that's the Middle East policy. Kennedy was basically pro-Arab, and Lyndon Johnson was decidedly pro-Israel, and that's why it was a coup. It was a foreign policy coup, and that expression, actually, foreign policy coup, has been used recently by James D. Eugenio, who is another prominent Kennedy researcher with whom I've corresponded. I've exchanged. I've written articles about the film he made with Oliver Stone recently, the documentary, wonderful work. And that's another guy who is also moving in that direction, because he has studied he's the best historian of John Kennedy, in my view, at least of John Kennedy's foreign policy. And he absolutely used his work a lot, because he showed that John Kennedy's foreign policy was absolutely incredibly innovative, incredibly bold and creative and unusual and challenging for the establishment. And he showed that there was a complete reversal of foreign policy between Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, and nowhere more than in the Middle East. So when you understand that very clearly, that it was a coup to change American foreign policy in the Middle East, and when you understand what is now American foreign policy in the Middle East, what is it? It's basically America is doing whatever Israel wants them to do in the Middle East. That's what we're witnessing today, and that would never have happened if Kennedy had not been killed. If Kennedy had not been killed, we can understand he would have been president until 1968. in 1968, it's not implausible that his brother would have taken over.
Yeah.
I mean, at least that was the vision of their father. He had a dynastic vision. So absolutely, the world would have been completely different. It all changed under Lyndon Johnson. The changes under Lyndon Johnson were absolutely tremendous. And today, there are a few books that have been written about Kennedy's foreign policy and the changes that took place after, and that makes it very clear that it was a coup to reverse, the American policy in the Middle East in the advantage of Israel. I mean, that's not a theory, that's not an hypothesis, that's a fact.
You mentioned earlier that RFK wanted to make AIPAC register as a foreign agent. We see the power of AIPAC today that if you disagree with Israeli policy, they'll primary you. They'll give millions of dollars to your primary opponent to control Congress. But the Kennedy dynasty, Joe, Jack, and Robert, these were sharp guys. Couldn't they see the writing on the wall and say, okay, let's just take the AIPAC money and go along with go along?
Well, as I've been studying the Kennedy family for some time, I became very impressed by them in many ways. I feel John Kennedy, particularly, if you study his life, you read books by his friends, there's quite a many portraits written about him by friends, and he comes out as a guy who actually was not afraid of death. And the reason he was not afraid of death, and that's actually very well, the point is very well made by James Douglas. Even though I criticize James Douglas' book, I strongly recommend reading it, because he makes a great portrait of John Kennedy as a man who knew death already a few times. He almost died quite a few times. So he was a man with a stoic approach to life, and that's why also when you look at what happened in Dallas, you wonder how could he accept to put himself in that position in a limousine with no roof, and he was all smiling in this situation where it was extremely dangerous. So he was just a guy who just trusted his security, secret service security. He was just a person who knew the risk. He knew what he was up to. And, the whole family is an interesting, they're really fascinating. One thing which is very fascinating about the Kennedy dynasty is that Joe Kennedy ended up on the wrong side of history after World War II, because he had been, very much involved in trying to prevent Roosevelt from entering the war. He was very angry at Roosevelt. But somehow he managed to survive, not as a man, but as a family. He kind of retired, but he supported his son's political career. And already it's quite mysterious that the Kennedys were not destroyed even before getting to the White House, because and that has to do with, of course, the father's political genius. He had enough leverage on the media and so on to promote his sons. But until you get shot in the head, you probably don't imagine you're going to get shot in the head. So I don't know about what Kennedy was thinking. But James Douglas gives a lot of hint that he actually knew he was risking his life.
On that note, we are out of time. We've been talking to Laurent Guyénot, and that's spelled Laurent Guyénot, and you could find his writing at the Uns Review, unz.com. The book we've been talking about is The Unspoken Kennedy Truth. Got another book coming up, The Papal Curse. Give me a call, shoot me an email when that comes out. We'll have you come back, okay? And
sure.
Another big book that he's known for is Yahweh to Zion. So check out Amazon.com, Laurent Guyénot. Sir, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Ed.
Good night.
It was my pleasure.
My pleasure,
Bye.
too. Thank you.